In recent months, a silent but deeply symbolic movement began to spread through the Eastern Europe. Something that seemed to have been in the past, in the shadows of the Cold War, is coming back. Countries that once celebrated peace and disarmament are now reevaluating historical commitments. What is happening? Why is Europe in the 21st century talking again about terrestrial mines? In this video, we will understand what is carrying 5 European countries, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland, to prepare to revoke the Treaty of Ottawa, an international agreement signed in 1997 that prohibits the use of antipersonnel mines. And most importantly, why are these countries considering installing mines along their borders with Russia? All this is happening in a growing tension scenario. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the climate between the West and Moscow worsened dramatically. What was a distant fear became a royal military concern. For these countries that share direct borders with Russia, war is no longer just a remote possibility, it is a tangible, almost palpable threat. These 5 countries, all with stories marked by Russian or Soviet occupations, have reinforced their defenses, increased military spending, and now question the limits imposed by disarmament agreements signed in times of relative stability. The Treaty of Ottawa, which banned the production, use, and storage of antipersonnel mines, is being placed on the balance again. According to the governments involved, the rules of peace no longer serve in an imminent war scenario. But, as expected, this decision has generated strong international criticism. Humanitarian organizations and civil rights groups are sounding the alarm. The international campaign to ban Minas Gerais, winner of the Nobel Peace Nobel Prize in 1997, classified the movement as a civilizational setback. According to these entities, anti-personnel mines are not effective against modern armies and serve only to cause prolonged human suffering, mainly civilians, even decades after the end of the fighting. And there are facts that are based on these criticisms. In many countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, landmines still make victims, often children, years or even decades after the conflicts ended. They are silent and persistent weapons, buried in the ground, invisible until it is too late. But this argument has not convinced the countries that now live under the shadow of Russian expansionism. For them, the dilemma is simple: accept the risk of civil deaths in the future or become vulnerable to an invasion now. To better understand this logic, just look at what is happening on the Ukrainian front. The war between Ukraine and Russia has been a true military laboratory, where weapons of all types are tested on the field. And among them, the mines, both anti-tanker and anti-personnel, have played a crucial role. According to field analysis, more Russian vehicles were destroyed by landmines than by missiles or RPGs. Videos released on social networks show tanks being unusable while trying to advance through mined areas, forcing the retreat or reorganization of troops. In the case of antipersonnel mines, the impact is more tactical than lethal. These mines are not designed to kill immediately, but to hurt severely, forcing the enemy army to mobilize soldiers and resources for medical evacuation. The result is the withdrawal of up to 5 combatants due to a single detonation. In position wars such as Ukraine, where each feat of advancement requires high cost, this type of weapon becomes an extremely effective war tool. Based on this, European countries bordering Russia see in mines a way to complicate and slow an enemy advance, even if they do not completely prevent an invasion. And this detail makes all the difference. According to defense experts, the idea is not to block tanks with anti-personnel mines, but force the enemy to slow down, expose more, unfold engineering units, and make room for coordinated attacks with artillery fire or drones. All this added creates what the military call the denial zone, a space in which the enemy thinks twice before entering. It is in this context that the cited countries begin to prepare legal and logistics changes. The mines used will probably no longer those old and indiscriminate versions that remained decades in the ground after conflicts. Technology has evolved. The tendency is the use of programmable and self-destructive mines, equipped with timers that deactivate or detonate them after a certain period, reducing post-war civilian risks. At the same time, the use of pressure mines such as Russian PMN or American M14, classic models activated by weight and difficult to detect because they contain little metal. The advance of these discussions behind the scenes and military, an inevitable question begins to form. Are we moving towards a new war paradigm in Europe? What's more, what are the political and moral consequences of reintroducing weapons that have been considered unacceptable for decades? For the most cautious international analysts, the answer is alarming. The possible revocation of the Ottawa Treaty by European countries creates what many call the domino effect of disarmament. In other words, if Europe, historically one of the most active defenders of weapon control treaties, start breaking commitments to international agreements, this can trigger a chain reaction that also weakens treaties on chemical, biological, and even nuclear weapons. The argument of critics is simple. If a treaty like that of anti-personal mines can be ignored, why would others be respected? And it is not just speculation. The international legal system is based on trust and reciprocity. A country signs and fulfills a certain agreement because it believes that the others will also do so. If this confidence is broken, it goes into dangerous ground where each nation acts on its own, prioritizing fear rather than diplomacy. But from the point of view of the front-line countries with Russia, this is precisely the only realistic way of surviving. And Lithuania was the first to take this step. According to reports, it all began in 2023, when then Lithuanian Defense Minister Laurynas Kasčiūnas attended meetings with military commanders who reported a very clear problem. Without mines, there was no way to contain rapid advances of Russian mechanized troops. The minister's words were direct and incisive. He said that even if the mines do not completely stop a Russian offensive, they would be crucial to gain time, cause disorganization and expose vulnerable points of the enemy. The concept is similar to the emergency brake on a high-speed train, does not solve the problem completely, but creates a reaction window. This change of mindset began to gain body throughout the Baltic region. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have long, open, and difficult to defend. Historically, these areas were routes of earthly invasion, whether in the First or in World War II. With the Russian threat re-emerging, the ghosts of the past returned in full force. Poland, in turn, had been reinforcing its armed forces since 2014, after the annexation of Crimea. But it was in 2022, with the beginning of the war on a large scale in Ukraine, that the country decided to double its military investments. It is currently one of the nations that spend the most with defense throughout NATO. The abandonment of the Ottawa Treaty is seen by Warsaw as a logical evolution of this posture, especially in the face of the collapse of conventional security in Eastern Europe. Finland, traditionally neutral, also surprised the world by joining NATO. Now, as a formal member of the Western Military Alliance, the country is forced to rethink its defensive strategies. And here, the mines will gain protagonism again. With a border of over 1,300 kilometers with Russia, Finland knows it will be one of the first lines of contact in case of military climb. For Finnish military strategists, there is no more room for ingenuity. The priority has been dissuaded, delayed, and resisting. But if these countries are preparing to use modern mines, others warn that there is no intelligent or safe mine enough to avoid tragedies. Even timer mines can fail, and even with detailed maps of mined fields, reality in a war is unpredictable. Soil displacements, destruction of human infrastructure, and failures make miners traps forgotten for decades, often detonated by children, farmers, or civilians returning to rebuild their lives. Ukraine serves again as a key example in this debate. In July 2025, President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a decree formalizing the country's departure from the Ottawa Convention. The justification was clear. We cannot continue following a norm that our aggressor completely ignores. Russia, in fact, has never signed the treaty, and since the beginning of the conflict has used mines on a large scale, which resulted in catastrophic losses to the Ukrainian forces during the 2023 counter-enemy failure. The difference between Ukraine and European countries is that Kyiv, even without more adhering to the treaty, still has an active arsenal of more than 3 million anti-personnel mines, something that Europeans no longer have, as they had destroyed their stocks as required by the treaty. This means that, to reinstall the use of mines, it will be necessary to rebuild the entire production, training, and storage chain, which in itself raises additional safety and logistics concerns. But for the advocates of this strategic turnaround, there is no more time for hesitation. Mines, even with all their risks and controversy, are seen as one of the last resources available to curb a fulminant military offensive. And in the cold calculation of war, sacrificing a principle may seem preferable to lose an entire country. The debate on the reintroduction of landmines in Europe is not just a technical or military issue. He reveals, above all, the degree of tension and distrust that dominated the continent again. For decades, Europe has built its political identity based on multilateralism, diplomacy, and defense of human rights. Ottawa's treaty was a symbol of this era, a bet on dialogue, limiting the horrors of war, the protection of civilians. Today, all this is being placed in check. Critics say we are facing the reopening of a Pandora box. That, justifying the return of mines based on fear, we are normalizing the use of weapons that should be forever buried, but not in the ground, but in history. According to experts, if Europe again employs antipersonnel mines, other countries in the world will follow the example, claiming the same reasons of self-defense. In practice, what we have is slow but progressive erosion of the international weapon control regime. On the other hand, the leaders of the Eastern European countries are categorical. They don't want war, but they are not willing to repeat past mistakes when they have waited too much to react to the Russian threat. For them, the mines do not represent a glorification of war, but a last resort to the real possibility of invasion. And there is still an element that few comment, but which weighs a lot in strategic decisions: the psychological factor. Minefields create a kind of fear that goes beyond physical destruction. An army that knows how to be in front of a mined area acts more cautiously, slowing down, changes routes. This affects time, morals, and coordination of invasive troops. In a resistance war, as any conflict in NATO territory, gaining time means saving lives and preparing more effective counterattacks. This is precisely why analysts believe that mines will be part of a hybrid and integrated strategy. They will not work in isolation. They will be used next to anti-trinker mines, physical obstacles such as dragon pit and teeth, as well as air cover or land. The goal is not to win with mines, but to create what is called depth defense, a series of defensive layers that increase the cost and difficulty of any enemy advancement. But what may be most impressed in this whole scenario is, like such an old, rudimentary, and internationally condemned weapon, is being rethought with such intensity. This shows that, in the end, war is still moved by simple solutions as long as they are effective. And the mines, despite their bad fame, remain effective when well used. Europe, therefore, finds itself before an iron dilemma: protecting the values it has built over the last decades, or protecting its borders with all available means. The answer, it seems, has already begun to be given. The progressive abandonment of the Ottawa Treaty, led by countries that feel in line of shooting, is a direct reflection of the breach of confidence in the international system. When treated stop protecting, countries come to protect themselves alone. And what about Ukraine? The country that has become a symbol of democratic resistance in the 21st century is now forced to adopt the same tactics as the enemy not to be destroyed. In July 2025, with the official signature of its departure from the treaty, Ukraine made it clear that the rules of war changed. If Russia has never respected the convention, why should Kiev keep fighting with moral and material disadvantage? The Ukrainian decision reverberated hard among his neighbors. The fact that Ukraine still has more than 3 million anti-personnel mines was a warning to countries such as Poland and Finland, who had destroyed their arsenals. Now they run against time to reactivate capabilities that have taken decades to be dismantled. But even with all tactical movement and security arguments, the ethical question remains unfalling. Is it possible to avoid this return of mines with a firmer posture of the international community against Russia? Or would we all be just reacting too late to an enemy who never really changed? What is clear is that, more than weapons, what is being undermined in Europe is the ideal of peace, sustained peace, and mutual trust. And perhaps this is the greatest risk of all: getting used to the idea that only strength solves. Because, at the moment mines are fired again at the borders, we also buried part of the dream of a continent that believed it was possible to live without fear of war.